How to come up with awesome game ideas in huge quantities. Let's go. Hey, this is Jonas, and in my opinion, making a successful indie game starts with the correct game idea. So we'll start out by talking about what is a good game idea. We need to know what we want to generate before we can generate it. And after that, I'll share with you my 3-step process for generating awesome game ideas. What is your definition of a good game idea? Well, here's mine. First of all, a good game idea is something you're excited to work on. A good game idea is something with a reasonable scope, you know you can execute. There's a target audience for your game idea with a somewhat decent size. And finally, a good game idea also excites others to hear about it, especially those in your target audience. Now, it's relatively easy to come up with a game idea that you yourself are excited about, but is it also possible to come up with a game idea that other people are excited about? And I think yes, you can. If you want to have a game idea that's also exciting for others, not just for you, then I think your game idea needs to be easy to communicate. If it takes half an hour to understand your game idea, then it's gonna be very hard to get people excited about it. This is Beat Pirates, and I think we had pretty much that exact issue here. It's a cool game, but it just takes too long to explain why it's cool and how it works. Then next up, you should have a good amount of familiarity in your game idea. It should be about something people already know and like, so you can leverage those positive feelings, but then also be careful, because too much familiarity will kill the curiosity of your potential players. What you wanna do is find the correct middle ground between familiar and original. For Ovusnova, I ended up way too much on the original side of things, for example. And I mean, yes, some people appreciate that sort of originality, but I feel like for the huge majority that doesn't create any appeal at all. What does create a lot of appeal for your game idea is an appealing fantasy. So basically, is this something the player would like to do in real life? Would you like to manage a couple of slimy aliens in space, for example? No, probably not. But would you like to be Centaur, and would you like to have a super powerful snow gun? On paper, that definitely sounds a lot better. Obviously, people have different preferences, but anyway, some fantasies are just not as appealing as others. The last thing that plays a big role in my opinion is evoking emotions. Best example I can come up with at the moment is Philophobia by Tim Ruswick. There are pretty strong emotions built right into the game idea. It's a game where love is literally hell. So just to recap, these points right here are what makes your game exciting and appealing to others, but you also need to check all of these boxes right here. So by now you should be able to tell that this is not easy. Coming up with a game idea is already more than hard enough. Coming up with a good idea that checks all of those boxes is even harder. I'm gonna share with you my 3-step process for coming up with great game ideas. I think it works pretty reliably, at the very least for me. Hope it works for you as well. So my step number 1 is start with something familiar. That can either be a popular game that already exists, a genre, maybe even a real-life scenario, a setting, whatever you want. Just something people know and something people are familiar with. Because first of all, that helps you to move from a white sheet of paper to something. And secondly, it also helps you to get that familiarity in there right away. If you actually want to get something out of this, grab a pen, a sheet of paper, and at the end of the video you will have a couple of cool game ideas to choose from. Why is it important to come up with multiple new game ideas? That's because then we can compare them with the factors we just discussed. We're at a stage where producing quantity is still pretty easy, so let's do that. Let's produce a bunch of game ideas and then just pick the best one at the end. Here I have a couple of examples for you how this could look like. Really just start with something people know, for example a tower defense game or a game about cooking. People know what cooking is. Also pick topics you are excited about, for example surviving on an island or a zombie apocalypse. That's the 2 points we're trying to check off here, something people are familiar with and something you actually enjoy and want to work on. For a story-based game you could start with something like a typical love story, or starting with a cool fantasy like building a water park is also a good idea. Okay, step number 2, turn your game idea into something new and original. There are a bunch of ways you can do that. One of the most popular ones is to add a new core mechanic. So for example, we could just take the basic platformer and allow the player to drill through walls. Or we could make a tower defense game where turrets get stronger when they are idle. The question you might have now is, how do you even come up with a good core mechanic? I think a good way to go about it is to think about all of the problems the player has to overcome in your game. For example, in a platformer you need to get from A to B, you need to navigate, you need to collect stuff, you need to go upwards. So which possible solutions could there be to all of those problems, or to some of those problems? In case you find that difficult, maybe even come up with a couple of new problems the player has to overcome. Enemies or roadblocks, for example. You could also remove a mechanic. For example, we could remove the jump from our platformer, so drilling through walls is the only way to propel you upwards. Or we could also try to make a match 3 game, where you're not allowed to swap the position of objects. You could try to combine multiple genres or mechanics. I kind of feel like combining our survival game with turn-based strategy, so let's do that. You can change or specify the setup, so oftentimes you can make your game ideas way more interesting simply by being more specific. For our turn-based strategy survival game, we could specify the time and the location, for example, 600 years in the future on a garbage island with a lot of cool electronic junk you can use to build your shelter. How about we try to build a water park in ancient Rome? So you can either specify the when and where, but you could also specify the what. Let's prepare some molecular cuisine in our cooking game, for example. Let's have a freaking zombie apocalypse in Stone Age and knights and dragons in a cool fantasy universe on flying islands. And finally, break the norms. So basically just look at the things that you'd usually expect in a game like this and mess with it. How about we make a tower defense game where you are the attacker and you send the waves for once? I'm also sure you wouldn't expect a cooking game to be a first-person shooter where you have to fire with ingredients. Let's make our zombies actually smart and civilized. In our fantasy game, you will be the dragon, and in our match 3 game, you'll have a little character that can push the objects around. And maybe what you wouldn't expect in a typical love story is that the main character is allergic to light. Step number 3 is simply to flesh your game idea out. There are a couple of questions you need to answer for your game idea. What are the obstacles the player has to overcome? What is the victory condition? What is the losing condition of the game? What is the core mechanics / the core decision? So what are you doing basically? What is the main thing you do in the game, and what else can the player do? For some game ideas like our tower defense game, answering these questions should be pretty straightforward. Other game ideas like our love story might need a little more love. We need to figure out if this is a point-and-click adventure or a dating sim, for example. One thing you should also definitely do in this stage is find your USP, your unique selling point. So what is the one thing that differentiates your game from all of the other games out there? In case there are multiple things that make your game unique, I'd focus on whatever delivers the best player fantasy. Next up, you want to simplify your game idea as much as possible. You know what your USP is, your unique selling point. You know what the core fantasy of your game is, what makes your game cool. So now just cut everything that's not necessary for that. Did you imagine this dragon fantasy game as a 3D online multiplayer action game? Then maybe you should reimagine it as a 2D pixel art single player game, cause that's a bit more realistic, isn't it? Next up, I want you to create a one-sentence pitch for all of your game ideas. Just what is your game all about and what makes it special? If your game idea is 30 paragraphs long, then it's too much. You prepare molecular gastronomy dishes with your food gun. That's how one of the pitches could look like, for example. Keep it simple, because this is a test of how easy it is to communicate your game idea, and I also recommend starting your pitch with the word you, because that makes it easier for the listener to imagine how it feels like to play your game. So you want to be very open-minded. Sometimes it's very good to let your ideas rest for a while, because when you just came up with them, you're oftentimes very emotionally invested into them, you're very excited about them, so just let them rest for a little bit, and then maybe in 2 or 3 weeks from now you'll be a lot better at judging how good they actually are. Also, that one sentence pitch that you came up with, share that with your friends. Tell it to people and see how they react. Maybe don't even tell them that it's your game. Just tell them, hey, I found out about a game that blah 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 blah. Tell them your pitch and see how they react. How excited exactly do they get when they hear about it? Unfortunately, you're still not finished. Your game idea needs to keep evolving during development, and you can still turn a bad game idea into a good game. You can still turn a good game idea into a bad game. So I highly recommend you watch the next video, which will help you to further develop your game idea. And see you then.